and welcome to the 18th episode of RNV Talks, in which we'll be discussing many different aspects of the history and culture of the Roma minority. This podcast is released as part of the EUROMIJA project, implemented by the Roma National Council of Croatia, within the framework of the European Solidarity Corps. Let's see what the team has prepared for us today.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to discuss an important international human rights treaty that has played a major role in the global fight against racism and discrimination. It's called the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or simply ICERD. We'll also explore what this convention means for Croatia, the progress the country has made, and the challenges that still remain, especially for Roma and other national minorities.
When we hear the words international convention, we often imagine a long legal document that only lawyers or diplomats need to understand. But the ICERD is actually much more than that. It's an agreement between countries that aims to ensure that everyone, regardless of their race, color, or ethnic origin, can enjoy human rights equally.
And understanding how this convention works also helps us understand why international organizations continue to monitor discrimination and encourage governments to improve their policies. So it's not simply about creating laws. It's about making sure these laws actually protect people in their everyday lives.
So let's start with a simple question. Why did the international community decide that a convention specifically focused on racial discrimination was necessary?
To answer that, we need to go back to the years after the Second World War. During the 1950s and 1960s, the United Nations had already developed several important human rights agreements. Countries increasingly recognized that protecting human rights should be part of international cooperation. But convincing governments to accept international obligations wasn't always easy.
One factor often encouraged countries to work together. Whenever a problem affected many countries at the same time, governments became much more willing to respond collectively. And racial discrimination became exactly that kind of issue.
And one event in particular had a profound impact. Between the end of 1959 and the beginning of 1960, a sudden wave of anti-Semitic incidents spread across several countries. Historians often refer to this period as the swastika epidemic.
In less than 3 months from December 1959 until March 1960, anti-Semitic acts increased dramatically in East and West Germany, England, Italy, Canada, the Netherlands, Brazil, Norway, United States, and South Africa. These attacks took many forms. Swastikas were painted on Jewish homes, synagogues, and other institutions. Members of Jewish communities received anonymous threatening letters and telephone calls. Although historians still debate exactly what caused this sudden wave of hatred, one thing is certain: its scale alarmed governments around the world.
For many countries, this became a clear reminder that racism, anti-Semitism, and ethnic hatred could quickly spread across borders. It also demonstrated that discrimination wasn't simply an isolated problem affecting one country. It was an international concern that required an international response.
And around the same time, another important realization was taking place. Many governments had traditionally associated racial discrimination with colonialism, but they began to understand that racism could also exist within countries themselves.
Perhaps the clearest example was apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation where laws deliberately treated people differently based on race. The situation raised serious concerns throughout the international community. Governments increasingly recognized that large-scale human rights violations could no longer be dismissed as purely domestic matters.
In other words, protecting people from racial discrimination became a legitimate concern for the international community as a whole. This represented an important shift in international law. Countries were gradually accepting that human rights protection sometimes required international oversight and cooperation.
So, how did the United Nations respond?
In 1965, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. 4 years later, in 1969, the convention officially entered into force. Today, 182 countries have joined it, agreeing to respect its principles and fulfill its obligations.
One interesting aspect of the convention is that it's relatively short. It contains only 25 articles, making it one of the more accessible international human rights treaties. Even people without a legal background can understand its main objectives.
So, what exactly does this convention define as racial discrimination?
Article 1 provides a clear definition. It describes racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin that limits a person's equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. That means discrimination isn't only about someone's intentions. If people are prevented from enjoying their rights equally because of their background, the Convention considers that as discrimination.
And those rights cover many different areas of life. They include education, employment, housing, healthcare, political participation, culture, and other areas of public life. The goal is to ensure that everyone can participate in society on an equal basis.
So, in other words, defining discrimination is only the first step. But what are countries actually expected to do once they join the convention? What responsibilities does it take on?
So, those answers can be found in Articles 2 to 7 of the Convention. These articles outline the obligations that every state party agrees to fulfill. First, governments must prohibit and eliminate racial discrimination in all its forms. They are also required to condemn racial segregation and apartheid and to prevent policies or practices that discriminate against people because of their race or ethnic origin.
The Convention also requires countries to prohibit racial incitement. That means governments should take action against expressions or activities that promote racial hatred or encourage discrimination and violence against particular groups. Another important obligation is ensuring equality before the law. People should enjoy the same rights and freedoms regardless of their racial or ethnic background. And if someone experiences racial discrimination, they should have access to effective legal remedies and protection.
But the Convention isn't focused only on laws and courts. It also recognizes that prejudice often begins with misinformation, stereotypes, and intolerance. That's why it encourages governments to promote understanding through education, culture, and public awareness. Schools, in particular, are seen as important places for teaching respect, equality, and diversity.
So the convention doesn't simply react to discrimination after it happens. It also tries to prevent discrimination before it occurs by encouraging education and mutual understanding. But that raises another important question. How do we know whether countries are actually keeping these promises?
Like many United Nations human rights treaties, the Convention has its own monitoring body. It's called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Its role is to examine whether countries are implementing the Convention effectively.
And every 2 years, countries that have ratified the Convention are expected to submit a periodic report to the committee. These reports explain what measures governments have taken to implement the first 7 articles of the Convention and how they've responded to recommendations made during previous reviews. The reports should also describe the situation of groups that may experience discrimination and explain how civil society organizations have participated in the reporting process.
So it's not simply a matter of sending a document and moving on. The committee carefully reviews the information and provides its own assessment.
Exactly. And after examining each report, the committee prepares what's known as concluding observations. These documents usually contain 3 parts. First, there's an introduction. Second, the committee highlights positive developments and progress made by the country. And finally, it identifies areas of concern and makes recommendations for improvement. In other words, the committee acknowledges achievements while also pointing out where more work is needed.
So to talk a bit more about Croatia, how does it fit into this process?
Well, the story actually begins before Croatia became independent. The former Yugoslavia signed the convention in 1966. And after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, Croatia succeeded to the convention in 1992, becoming responsible for implementing its obligations as an independent state. Since then, Croatia has periodically reported to the committee on the measures it has taken to combat racial discrimination.
The most recent review took place in 2023. In August of that year, the committee published its concluding observations on Croatia's combined 9th to 14th periodic reports. Like all concluding observations, the document recognizes both progress and remaining challenges.
Let's begin with the positive side. What improvements did the committee recognize?
Well, among the most significant developments was the adoption of a revised protocol for procedures in cases of hate crimes. This is an important step because it helps authorities respond more effectively when crimes are motivated by racial or ethnic hatred. The committee itself also welcomed the adoption of Croatia's national Roma inclusion plan, covering the period from 2021 to 2027. And this national strategy essentially aims to improve the inclusion of Roma communities across different areas of public life.
These measures demonstrate that Croatia has taken steps to strengthen its legal and policy framework. For national minorities, including Roma, these initiatives represent important commitments toward improving equality and social inclusion. But as the committee also emphasized, adopting policies is only part of the process. Their success depends on how effectively they are implemented in practice.
And that's where the committee identified several important concerns. What are the main issues that still need to be addressed?
One concern is the lack of accurate and comprehensive information about the social and economic conditions of certain vulnerable groups, including Roma, Serbs, and some non-citizens. Without reliable data, it's much more difficult for governments to understand the extent of inequalities or, design effective policies to address them.
The committee also expressed concern about the continuing discrimination experienced by Roma and Serb communities, particularly in education and employment. Although legal protections exist, discrimination continues to affect people's opportunities in everyday life. This shows that changing laws alone is not always enough. Social attitudes and institutional practices also need to change.
Another issue highlighted by the committee relates to stereotypes. Why is that considered such an important problem?
Because stereotypes often become the foundation for discrimination. The committee noted that negative stereotypes about Roma and Serbs, for example, continue to circulate in public discourse. And then these stereotypes can later fuel racist hate speech, and in some cases even contribute to hate crimes. When false or harmful narratives become widespread, they reinforce prejudice and make discrimination more likely.
The committee's concerns were also echoed by another United Nations body, the Human Rights Committee, which monitors the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In its 2024 observations, it also encouraged Croatia to strengthen its response to hate speech and hate crimes. Particularly worrying is the fact that some incidents involve politicians and other influential public figures, both at the national and local levels. Because of their visibility, public figures have an important responsibility to promote respectful public discourse rather than contribute to division.
So, what solutions does the committee propose?
One recommendation is to provide more specialized training for police officers, public prosecutors, and other law enforcement officials. The goal is to help them better recognize hate crimes, investigate them effectively, and ensure the victims receive appropriate protection.
Training is particularly important because hate crimes often involve motivations that may not be immediately obvious. Recognizing when prejudice is a factor can influence how authorities investigate a case and how justice is ultimately delivered.
And these recommendations remind us that fighting discrimination isn't only about creating laws, it's also about making sure that institutions responsible for enforcing those laws have the knowledge and tools they need. But the committee also identified several practical challenges that continue to affect the lives of Roma and other vulnerable communities. One of these concerns is access to justice. Why is this such an important issue?
Because having the rights on paper is only meaningful if people are able to exercise those rights in practice. If someone experiences discrimination but cannot afford legal assistance or simply doesn't know where to seek help, obtaining justice becomes much more difficult.
And this is exactly why the committee raised concerns about access to free legal aid in Croatia, particularly for vulnerable groups such as Roma and Serbs. Although Croatia adopted the Free Legal Aid Act in 2013, the committee noted that the system still has significant shortcomings.
What kind of shortcomings are we talking about?
So the law was weakened during its adoption because of several requests made by the Croatian Bar Association. As a result, access to legal aid became more limited than it originally intended. And when the law was put into practice, the implementation further reduced the availability of these services.
The committee points out that no major improvements have been made since then. And this means that many people who could benefit from free legal aid either struggle to access it or may not even know that these services exist. And without effective legal assistance, victims or discrimination may be less likely to report violations or pursue legal action.
Also, another issue that received particular attention from the committee was the situation of Roma communities in Croatia. In fact, the committee dedicated an entire section of its observations to this topic. What were its main concerns?
Although the committee welcomed the adoption of the National Roma Inclusion Plan, it also stressed that many Roma continue to face very difficult living conditions. One of the biggest concerns is the high level of poverty experienced by many Roma communities. Closely connected to this are substandard housing conditions and high unemployment rates, which continue to affect opportunities for social inclusion.
Education is another area where significant challenges remain. The committee expressed concern about the relatively low attendance of Roma children in secondary schools, as well as high dropout rates across different levels of education. These barriers can have long-term consequences because education is closely linked to future employment opportunities, financial security, and participation in society.
The committee also discussed segregation in education. Can you explain what that means?
The committee highlighted the continued existence of segregated education, particularly in the Medjugorje region. Segregation means that children are separated on the basis of their ethnic background instead of learning together in equal educational environments. International human rights bodies have repeatedly emphasized that inclusive education is essential for promoting equality and reducing discrimination.
The committee also raised concerns about housing. It referred to cases involving house demolitions and forced evictions affecting Roma communities. According to the observations, some families have been removed from their homes without being offered adequate alternative housing or appropriate compensation. And this creates additional insecurity for communities that are already among the most vulnerable.
Some listeners might wonder whether these recommendations are legally binding. If the committee identifies concerns, what happens next?
The committee's concluding observations don't function like a court judgment. Instead, they provide expert recommendations and guidance to governments. Their purpose is to help countries improve the implementation of the Convention and strengthen the protection of human rights.
Not to forget that they're also an important source of accountability, because the reporting process takes place regularly. Governments are expected to explain what progress they've made and how they responded to previous recommendations. This creates an ongoing dialogue between the United Nations and each state party.
Of course, governments are not the only actors involved in this process. Civil society also holds a very important role.
Yes, and civil society organizations often work directly with communities affected by discrimination. Because of this, they can identify problems that may not always appear in official reports. They also help raise awareness, provide legal assistance, advocate for policy changes, and support vulnerable groups in exercising their rights.
Cooperation between governments, non-governmental organizations, and civil society activists can produce better and faster results. But that cooperation depends on decision makers being willing to listen to these recommendations and engage in constant constructive dialogue. When institutions and civil society work together, policies are often more effective because they're informed by the real experiences of the people they're intended to support.
As we come to the end of today's episode, I think one message really stands out. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination represents an important commitment by countries around the world to protect equality and combat discrimination. But adopting international agreements is only the beginning. Their true value depends on how effectively they are implemented in everyday life.
Croatia has taken important steps in recent years, including strengthening procedures for responding to hate crimes and adopting the National Roma Inclusion Plan. At the same time, the United Nations Committee has identified several areas where further progress is needed. These include improving access to legal aid, addressing discrimination in education and employment, combating hate speech and hate crimes, reducing poverty, and improving housing conditions for Roma communities.
Ultimately, the Convention reminds us that protecting human rights is an ongoing process. It requires strong institutions, effective laws, informed public policies, and cooperation between governments and civil society. Most importantly, it requires genuine commitment to ensuring that every person is treated with dignity and equality, regardless of their race or ethnic background.
Thank you for listening to this episode of RNV Talks. We hope today's discussion has helped you better understand the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, how it is implemented in Croatia, and why continuing efforts to combat discrimination remain so important. Until next time, goodbye everyone.